I can't tell you how happy and pleased I am that we're celebrating 40 years. I think JLT had a big impact on the development of our field, and it's amazing how the field has progressed from way back in the 70s to now. It's just totally unbelievable. You would have never projected what you're doing now back then. Just no way. Um, so I really appreciate all the work that people here have done. I want to second what Doug said. It's people like you that made a big difference in keeping JLT viable and at the forefront. And so I want to thank you personally for not having the journal that I start flop. And so it's been a long time, but it's really contributed to this to the technology advancement. I like to say a few words about starting the journal. Starting the journal typically isn't too bad. It's pretty straightforward. JLT certainly has to be an exception to that. If you go back into the 70s, there wasn't a journal for Lightwave. And so everybody published in just about any journal they wanted to publish. And there were at least 12 that I could think of where people were publishing. And so what that meant is to keep up with the field, you had to read 12 journals or some large number of journals. And most people felt this was a burden. The other thing that was happening then was it was becoming obvious that fiber optics and light wave was taking off. And so really the time was, it was felt that it's time to really have our own journal. Um, it turns out that I was up at RCA Laboratories. I was up there on a contract review, and I was talking to Henry Cursell. Henry and I discussed the need for the journal, and we both agreed that we wanted to push for it. Now, most of you don't know Henry because I see very little gray hair out there. But Henry was a vice president of technology at RCA Labs. He was an expert in diode lasers, semiconductor diode lasers at the time. But more importantly, he was the first president of Quantum Electronic and Application Society, QEAS. QEAS, you may never have heard of, but that later changed its name to LEOS, which later changed its name to Photonic Society. So that was the initial Photonic Society by another name. So Henry was the first president, and that activity was really very helpful. He knew his way around the IEEE better than I did, which was going to come in handy in developing the journal. Who would have thought when we got into this that we would have had to jump through so many hoops? So we agreed. We called up Dean Anderson. He was the second president of QEAS, current president at the time, and we got him on board. Both Henry and I knew him pretty well, so that wasn't really hard to do. And he was at Rockwell International at the time. So we proposed it to the board, the QEAS board, to start a new journal. And, you know, we thought it was an obvious thing to do because the technology was obviously taking off. We got a lot of pushback. The pushback came in the form of, we don't want another journal. We have too many to read already. And so, you know, and we explained, well, we want to be the journal for Lightwave. And not everybody bought that. And so we couldn't get it through initially, the board. So what we proposed to do was run a couple of special issues of JQE on fiber optics to show we could attract the papers. And I was the editor, guest editor for that. We ran it, and it was very successful. So we went back to the board, and they approved it. And then Henry Cursell brought it to the TAB, Technical Activities Board of IEEE, and we got their approval. So we thought we were kind of finished, and things were going to sail along very smoothly. We were wrong. The other societies, there were at least three or four at the time, felt that they couldn't let QEAS take over the fiber optics area, because if you had the journal, you had your foot in the door in doing that. And so they were going to start their own journal, exactly the opposite of what we were set out to do in the first place. So Henry and I went around to various society presidents and executive directors, and lots of conversation, some good, some bad, but we convinced them that it was good to have a single journal. And what we proposed, and they accepted it, was to have a committee run the journal with representatives from interested societies. So initially there were 5 societies that signed up for it, okay? Electron devices, QEAS, ComSoc, ultrasonics, it turned out, and MTT. Okay, those are all IEEE societies if you're not familiar with them. And so they signed up, and it turned out that there were 2 other societies that wanted in because they were publishing papers. So we were up to 7. And then there were 2 more that wanted to join because they thought that they were going to make some money publishing the journal. And they had nothing to do with guided wave optics. And so we had 9 sitting around the table, 9 societies. So it's the next barrier that came up then was, where was this group going to sit, in which society? Was it going to be in Leos or ComSoc or whatever? And because again, the one that captured that group and ran the journal would be associated with the technology. And so most of the societies had a strategic interest in not having that happen. And so again, we proposed to have it as a standalone group. And since there were 9 societies that had signed up to it, we brought it to TAB, and they approved it because 9 societies wanted it. Okay, so now we were ready. IEEE was in good shape. We were ready to go. In the first meeting that we had with the group, QEAS brought up the Optical Society. There was rumors, excuse me, there were rumors that OSA might start their own journal. And we didn't want that as a group. But, and so we proposed that they be invited to be another society. It was interesting. It was interesting dynamics around the table, because well, QEAS had a lot of members in common with OSA, and so it felt natural. But a lot of the societies didn't, and this was a foreign society to them, and so they didn't want any part of OSA, and so a lot more conversations and so on and so forth. And if you know IEEE politics, it takes a lot of time. But we talked them into it, and they had asked me to be the editor at that first meeting, which I agreed to do. So then they asked me to go to OSA and float the idea. So I called Joris Quinn up, who I knew very well. I had worked with Joris previously on a problem with OFC. And so we had worked together, and we solved that problem. I don't know if you knew Joris. He passed away, of course, but he was a master of getting things done. And politically, he was soft-spoken, and and easy to get along with, but he was extremely effective. So I called him, and he kind of was receptive to the idea, and he invited me to come up to OSA. And so I drove across town and went up there one afternoon, and we chatted about it. And it's basically a strategy chat. And he said, "Okay, I'll take it from here." And I don't know what he did, but he called me back up and said, "We're in." So now we had the joint journal established. Um, the first task was to publish the first papers, of course, and get them in. So we started quarterly. Then the second year was bi-monthly, and then the third year was annually. Excuse me, monthly that we published it. We made the effort to tie it to OFC because OFC was growing just as much as the community. And we ran a special issue from selected papers from OFC. And we've done that through the years consistently. And so the journal was off and running. And, um, the main thing I did was kept asking for more pages. The budget was limited. In fact, a couple of the societies dropped out because the first few years were losses in the budget, which you would expect starting something up, a loss leader. So a couple that thought they were going to make it rich uh, dropped off, and we ended up with the 7 plus the OSA, and that's where we are today. And so after 6 years, I stepped down, and I think it was who was the next one? It wasn't Alan. It was Ron. Ron Alphiness was the next editor. Who was Don Keck? Yeah, Don Keck. Yeah, right. Okay, that's right. Yeah, Don's not here today either. But let me turn it over to Alan now, and he can pick up the second 6 years or beyond that. Alan.